Just to sort of conclude the section on marriage in the scriptures, I had a few catechism quotes that I wanted to give you that went along with some of the scriptures as well. Someone asked during the break if I had a list of the scripture references that I used in the catechism quotes, and I do. I can give you the ones that I've used. It doesn't exhaust all of the catechism quotes or scripture quotes about marriage. I'll give those to you towards the end of the talk today if you remind me. I'll also take the PowerPoint that I have prepared for you that I can't use today, and I'll send that to Deacon Jen, and maybe he can get that out to you so you have the bullet points from the talk, and that will include the scripture quotations and the catechism references. Another good way to find good scriptural quotes is to use the catechism. If you go there and just go through the sacrament of marriage and look in the footnotes, it's cross-referenced with all the scriptural quotes. So you do a little hunting that way, but that's also a good way to find a bunch of quotes about marriage altogether. So we were just talking about husbands and wives being subordinate to one another, and that quote from Ephesians. And the Catechism makes a little reference to that. And this is, I picked and chose a little bit from 1615 and 1617. The Catechism says that this grace of Christian marriage is a fruit of Christ's cross, which is the source of all Christian life. The entire Christian life bears the mark of the spousal love of Christ in the church. Already in baptism, the entry into the people of God, baptism is a nuptial mystery. It is, so to speak, the nuptial bath which precedes the wedding feast. The wedding feast being the Eucharist. Christian marriage, in its turn, becomes an efficacious sign, the sacrament of the covenant of Christ and the church. Since it signifies and communicates grace, marriage between baptized persons is a true sacrament of the new covenant. So all the sacraments lead us straight back to the cross. And that quote from Ephesians about subordinating your life to the life of another draws us straight to the cross. So all the sacraments are about the cross of Christ, and in particular, that's the way that Christian marriage is. So that's from the Catechism 1615, 1617. And 1616 is actually just the quote from Ephesians, so I didn't repeat that. There's one there. So, the final portion of my presentation, and then we'll go for some questions and answers, is some contemporary pastoral challenges regarding marriage, so that we will encounter as ministers of God's church, that we encounter all the time, either in our preparation of couples to receive the sacrament, in our celebration of the sacrament, in our counseling of married couples, or even just the fact that you are a Catholic in the world today can spring up some interesting discussions about marriage. The first pastoral challenge to speak about is changing definitions of marriage. And we might say that marriage is in crisis today. Someone who lived through the 1960s, might say that marriage was in crisis in the 60s and 70s. Someone who lived in the 1930s might say that marriage was in crisis in the 1930s. Marriage has been in crisis since Adam and Eve. The whole world has been in crisis since Adam and Eve. This is the constant struggle for Christ to renew the earth in all realms, but also in particular marriage. is that there's always a crisis. Let me see if I can find a quote. Let me see if I can double task here. So even just in the last century, there have been many attempts to redefine marriage. Going back to the examples that I have about the church addressing this, come from Casti Calui, which is a weird sounding name, but it's an encyclical that Pope Pius XI wrote about marriage and family life. And this was written in 1930, Pius XI. Let's see if it doesn't ring true for today as well. Pius XI wrote, so the style of writing is a little bit old to our ears. For now, alas, not secretly, nor under cover, but openly, with all sense of shame put aside, now by word, again by writings, by theatrical productions of every kind, by romantic fiction, by amorous and frivolous novels, by cinema, portraying a vivid scene, in addresses broadcast by radio, in short, by all the inventions of modern science, the sanctity of marriage is trampled upon and derided. Divorce, adultery, all the basest vices either are extolled or at least are depicted in such colors as to appear to be free of all the reproach and infamy. At the very source of these evils, says this is all from Pius XI, their basic principle lies in this, that matrimony is repeatedly declared not to be instituted by the author of nature, nor raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a true sacrament, but something invented by man. The evil of this teaching is plainly seen from the consequences which its advocates deduce from it. Namely, that the laws, institutions, and customs by which wedlock is governed, since they take their origin solely from the will of man, are subject entirely to him, and hence can and must be founded, changed, and abrogated according to human caprice and the shifting circumstances of human affairs. With some slight changes in style, could have been written by Pope Francis. But this was 1930. Always, there is a temptation to focus on ourselves and not God, and to see ourselves as the author of everything, and to leave God out of the picture. And we do this frequently throughout human history with marriage. And it is no wonder, if marriage is what we have talked about it being, if marriage is the way that we encounter the love of the Trinity in this world, if it is a theology book about who God is, if it is an image of Christ and his church, of course it is going to be attacked and misunderstood and misrepresented. Not only because of ignorance or malicious men, but because there is an evil one who does not want us to know about God, who does not want us to live godly lives. There is a great tempter, a great deceiver. And so it makes all the sense in the world, if marriage is something so high and exalted, if it's so important, if it's so closely linked with the Trinity and with Christ, that the deceiver is going to work in the hearts of men to cloud their reason, to cloud their judgment, their knowledge, their understanding, and to confuse us about marriage. And so there are all sorts of changing definitions of what it means to be married. Whether it's divorce, exacerbated by no-fault divorce, whether it's contraception, whether it's homosexual unions, there are a plethora, there are a legion of ways that the culture tries to change the definition of marriage. And so it's not far-fetched to think that a couple coming to a minister of the church to be married don't know what marriage is anymore. Because they're being told 50 million different things from 50 million different people. Our culture and our society speaks very commonly and very nonchalantly about alternative definitions to marriage. That marriage is not indissoluble, that you can divorce even without a reason, not only for any reason at all, but even without a reason, a marriage can be ended. We have a culture that has said for years that children are a burden, and that now it's an option to have children. Now it's true, not all couples are able to have children, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the deliberate contraception of children. And so we lose a whole segment of what marriage is about. Remember, marriage is a union of a man and his wife for the procreation and education of offspring and the good of the spouses, which is indissoluble unity. And so we have one segment of the population that wants to take indissoluble unity out of the picture, that this is a temporary thing. We have another segment of the society that wants to take offspring out of the picture, and we lose a whole hunk of what marriage is. And then we have others in society that say, well, neither of those things have to do with marriage. Marriage is just about love. Love the one you're with. Right? Just sing along the song. So, it's not inconceivable that the couple sitting in front of you at pre-Cana or at Engaged Couples Conference or at the marriage workshops throughout the diocese or who you're preparing one-on-one for the sacrament, they don't know what the sacrament of marriage is. And so definitions are important. If theology teaches us anything, it's that. It's that God is not whoever I think he is. God is a specific person. Just like you're not whoever I say you are. I don't get to name you and decide the reality about you. You are who you are. God is who he is. And the things that God reveals to us are as they are, that we can define them with the help of God's grace and revelation, that marriage is one thing and it's not another. That God is one thing and he's not another. So changing definitions are a huge challenge to our pastoral ministry. Marriage is not just any other relationship between human beings. It's more than just love. And I'll be honest, even for someone who knows the truth about marriage, someone who's newly ordained, I tend sometimes, I have an inclination at least, to soft pedal things that are uncomfortable for me, or that I think people don't want to hear. This is the temptation of any minister. Now, in my better moments, I overcome that temptation. I don't give into it, and I preach the hard truth even when it makes me very uncomfortable. But this is a temptation for all of us, and sometimes it is tempting to soft pedal things that are difficult to hear. And I think, for me, one of the things that it's very easy to soft pedal is the children aspect, is the offspring. Because, at least in popular myth, I never experienced this myself, but I hear tons of couples telling me this. Catholics are all just about making babies. That's all they care about. They want more babies because that'll mean more Catholics. That'll mean more in the collection plate. I've heard people say this. Pardon?
I said, the good thing you don't say Mexicans.
Good thing I don't say Mexicans. Now listen, I'm for children. But from time to time, I'll soft pedal that, because I don't want people to think that the church is just about, or that marriage is just about having as many children as possible. Because marriage is about more than that. It's about more than love, it's about more than children, it's about more than the group of stars. It's about all of that together. And whenever we isolate one to the detriment of the others, that's when we start to move away from the truth and the reality of marriage. So there might have been a time in the church when children were emphasized too much. That's possible. Again, that's not my personal experience, but I have a lot of people who tell me that. They don't like coming to Catholic weddings because the priest just tells them how many kids they have to have. People have said that to me. That's not my experience, but we'll pretend for the sake of argument that there was a time in the church where that was overemphasized to the detriment of the other realities of marriage. The temptation is for the pendulum to swing too far in the other direction. To say, okay, well, we're not going to emphasize that. We're going to soft pedal that one. We'll include it in there, but we're not going to make a big deal about the fact that you need to have kids, that you need to be open to life. And we'll just focus on the love part. Because then we begin to focus too much on that to the detriment of the other components of marriage. Good catechesis, good pastoral ministry keeps all of those things together. And so we have to look at our own lives and see what is our temptation to soft pedal. And we have to fight that temptation and present the truth of Christ, because the truth about marriage is not based on your experience or my experience or the couple's experience in front of me. It's based on truth. It's based on revelation. It's based on nature. It's based on Jesus. It's based on grace. It's based on all those things. So we have to look at where our own personal experiences or the perceived experiences of people that we're ministering to get in the way of the truth. We've got good news about marriage and family. So let's present the good news in its entirety. Marriage as it's defined. Not emphasizing one thing over another, because that's when we slip into any heresy, really. I guess that's what heresy is. It's the emphasizing of one thing to the detriment of something else. So marriage is about more than love. It is about love, it's about more than love. It is about children, it's about more than children. It is about indissolubility, it's more than indissolubility. We don't negate any of those things, we affirm them all, we bring them all together. We have to keep that whole definition intact. Another contemporary pastoral challenge is a general devaluing of marriage or an extolling of cohabitation. So the first thing, the devaluing of marriage, comes quickly following changing definitions of marriage. If marriage can mean anything, then it doesn't mean anything at all. If marriage can be whatever you decide it is, then it doesn't have a definition. It isn't anything. If I can remarry, if indissolubility is not part of it, why can't I be married to more than one person at a time? Why can't I be married to someone of the same sex? Why can't I be married to someone that I'm related to? Why can't? So at some point, the culture will say, no, you can't do that. But it'll be permissive of all sorts of other things. And so the idea is that there is a definition to marriage. And we've read it. And it comes from nature. It's raised by Christ to the level of a sacrament, but we can speak about marriage just on a natural level. We don't have to pull out our Bibles and our catechisms. It has a natural definition. And if we start to monkey around with that, then the whole thing falls apart. It doesn't mean anything anymore. So there's a general devaluing of marriage that goes along with changing the definition. There's also an extolling of cohabitation, which is nothing recent and nothing new, but that doesn't mean it's still not a challenge. If marriage is not about, this goes along with the procreation and education of offspring. If marriage is not about children, and I can contracept whatever kind of union I want to have, tax benefits? How romantic. Why would I get married? It's expensive. You gotta go get like a dress, all this business. We'll get married when we feel like having a party, but for now we'll just live together and have sex. That's basically a very popular way to live your life now. It comes, if the devaluing of marriage in general comes from changing the definitions, the extolling of cohabitation comes from our lack of emphasis on the importance of procreation and the raising of offspring. It's not all there is to marriage, but it's an important part of it. So we have to confront that as well and not give in to the mentality that, well, that's just the way things are these days. Things have been sinful for a long time. God calls us to grace, always. So we have to be able to call our people to grace and to holiness, to help them realize that that's possible. Mixed marriages. So I had computer problems on Thursday and lost everything, so I had to sort of reconstruct this whole business yesterday. And this was something that I added yesterday. I didn't have originally in there. And I don't really know what made me think of it. I think I was reading one technology. I was reading something, and it made me think of mixed marriages, which are, again, very common. They're something that happens all the time. In fact, we all have the faculty to do a mixed marriage, and we don't have to ask anyone for it. We just check the little box. Mixed marriage, not a problem. So I'm speaking here of marriages between a Catholic Christian and a non-Catholic Christian. And they've become so common that sometimes we interpret that as being a non-issue. And perhaps we soft pedal that too much. Not saying that a Catholic should not marry a Protestant. Again, we don't want to overemphasize something, but we also don't want to pretend that that's not an issue that needs to be talked about. If I'm a Catholic and I'm marrying a Methodist, for example, random example, I go to church as a Catholic on Sunday, and I believe that I am eating the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. Which is a radical thing if you don't believe that. That looks crazy and insane. If you don't believe that that's the actual body and blood of Christ, why are you kneeling down in adoration? That's blasphemy if you don't believe that. And so, if the Methodist is a good Methodist and the Catholic is a good Catholic, that's going to be a source of tension. Just as one example that could be many. If my Methodist is a good Methodist and my Catholic is a good Catholic, they should have problems with the fact that their spouse believes something so radically different. That's true, there's a lot in common, and that's to be affirmed. But we don't want to affirm that to the detriment of the fact that there are big differences there as well. That doesn't mean it can't work. It can. We've seen that lots of times. But in our catechesis, I think, I don't know, maybe again, this is my bias and my experience, is that we don't talk about that frequently at all. The differences between beliefs. If your Catholic's a good Catholic and your Methodist is a good Methodist, there's going to be some controversy. And either the Methodist will become not so good of a Methodist, and we'll sign them right up for RCIA, or the Catholic's going to become not too good of a Catholic. And then we've got problems. Still not good. Battery light stuff. So, just another consideration that maybe we don't want to gloss over in our ministry. No fault divorce, I have written down here. Things keep seeming to snowball after a while. It starts with divorce, and then it's no fault divorce, and then it's contraception, and then it's homosexuality.
And what I mean by this, not that all of those things haven't existed in the past, but what's snowballing is our cultural and society acceptance of all of those things as normal. 100 years ago, divorce was not unheard of, but it was a big deal. Now, it's on the news every night, the list of celebrities that have divorced their spouses after 6 months or 2 years or 7 years. It's a very normal part of life, and it's become very normal. When in fact, it's still a big deal. Contraception, again, this has been around for a long time, but recently, after no-fault divorce especially, contraception becomes very normal. 100 years ago, every Christian denomination would have been united in saying that artificial contraception is not a good thing. It goes against God's plan for sex and marriage. Flash forward to 100 years later, and you have Catholics and the Orthodox and some real fringe groups of other denominations that hold to that. And for everyone else, it's become just a normal part of married life, that sex does not have to lead to offspring. Along those lines, I want to read for a little while, to be honest with you, because I get fired up about things sometimes. For a little while, I carried this little paragraph that I'm going to read to you in my back pocket, so I had the actual words. Perhaps you've heard it before. It's certainly a very controversial paragraph. If you're ever in a boring conversation and want to spice things up, pull this out and start talking about it. It's from Humane Vitae. Very controversial document. Pope Paul VI, this was 1976? No. 68. It was 1968. Paul VI wrote Humane Vitae. And again, if Pius XI could speak to our day and age, then this proves, I think, that Pius VI, or that Pope Paul VI was a prophet. So this is number 17 from Humane Vitae. And this is about artificial contraception. Upright men can even better convince themselves of the solid grounds on which the teaching of the Church in this field is based, if they care to reflect upon the consequences of methods of artificial birth control. Let them consider, first of all, how wide and easy a road would thus be opened up towards conjugal infidelity and the general lowering of morality. Not much experience is needed in order to know human weakness and to understand that human beings, especially the young who are so vulnerable on this particular point, have need of encouragement to be faithful to the moral law, so that they must not be offered some easy means of eluding its observance. It is also to be feared that a man, growing used to the employment of anti-conceptive practices, may finally lose respect for woman, and no longer caring for her physical and psychological equilibrium, may come to the point of considering her as a mere instrument of selfish enjoyment, and no longer as his respected and beloved companion. If that hasn't come to pass, I'll eat my hat, which is an expression I don't really understand, but I use it a lot. But has not the widespread acceptance of artificial contraceptive opened up the road nice and wide to conjugal infidelity? If I can just contracept my sex, if a child's not going to come from it, then why can't I just have sex with other people? Because there are no consequences, which of course there are many consequences. But the idea is that that takes the consequence and burden of a child out of the picture. Conjugal infidelity, a general lowering of morality. Our afternoon movie selection today will be 50 Shades of Grey. Not true. Not true to the camera. General lowering of morality, though. Because sex becomes something that's just about selfish enjoyment. Man, in this case, he's actually talking about males. Males, growing used to the employment of contraceptive practices, may finally lose respect for women, and no longer caring for their physical and psychological equilibrium, may come to the point of considering her as a mere instrument of selfish enjoyment, and no longer as his respected and beloved companion. So contraception, kind of a huge deal, and it builds on the no-fault divorce. First, no-fault divorce is normal, then contraception becomes normal, and then homosexuality, which again is nothing new, just becomes a very normal thing. And so then it begins to say, well, why can't we change the definition of marriage to accommodate that love as well? Which doesn't have anything to do, certainly, with procreation and the education of offspring. So all of these things are contemporary pastoral challenges, not because every couple that comes to you to get married has had a no-fault divorce, is practicing contraception, and are homosexuals. Not because they're personally experiencing all of these things in their life, but because they're surrounded by a world that considers all of those things normal. So if all of those things normal and there is no definition of marriage, then what are we doing here? It's one of the questions that I ask couples the first time I meet with them. I say, why are you getting married? I'm for it, I tell them. I'm in favor of you getting married. I think this will be great. But why are you getting married? What does marriage mean to you? You'll be surprised at some of the answers you get if you've never asked couples that before. Seems very basic. But if you've never asked that, you'll be floored at some of the answers. You'll also be inspired at some of the answers. If you're having a particular cynical day, God might grace you with a surprisingly beautiful answer to that as well. But to make sure we're playing on the same level with definitions, because all of these forces are working against the church's understanding of what marriage is just by nature in and of itself. And the final thing is children are seen as a burden rather than a blessing. Huge. So many people see children as a burden rather than a blessing. My sister, my poor family, gets used in so many talks and homilies. You should pray for them. It's tough to be, it's tough to be married to clergy, for the wives that are here. It's tough to be related to a priest. My sister has 6 kids. I know some families with 2 kids. I know some families with 11 kids. That's fine. My sister has 6. All the time, she gets snide remarks and comments about having 6 kids. Do you have cable out in Custer, Ohio? Can you get satellite reception? Do you know what causes that? People, strangers, will say that. Because children are seen in our culture as a burden rather than a blessing. Something that will inhibit your freedom rather than expand your love. That's the prevailing sentiment. We will not go down the road of abortion and Planned Parenthood and all of the things that we could talk about, where children are not seen as something to be valued, something to be encouraged, but they're seen to be a necessary evil. I guess we have to have some kids if we want the human race to continue. That is not a far-fetched sentiment from what our culture gives to wider society. And so people that are coming to you for marriage preparation, to get married, for counseling, whatever, just in your daily life, might see one of the essential elements. Vatican II talks about children as the crown of all the other goods of marriage. The crown is removed. It's taken out of the picture. One of the greatest parts of marriage and family life is twisted and warped and seen as a burden. So that's a serious challenge as well. Now, this could get very fiery, this could get very passionate, this could get very political, this could get very negative, this could get very wallowy, this could go in a lot of directions. So we'll put the brakes on for a second and turn to the Second Vatican Council. Second Vatican Council, this is Gaudium et Spes, number 47. The well-being of the individual person and of human and Christian society is intimately linked with the healthy condition of that community produced by marriage and family. Hence, Christians and all men who hold this community in high esteem sincerely rejoice in the various ways by which men today find help in fostering this community of love and perfecting its life, and by which parents are assisted in their lofty calling. Those who rejoice in such aids look for additional benefits from them and labor to bring them about. Yet, the excellence of this institution is not everywhere reflected with equal brilliance, since polygamy, the plague of divorce, so-called free love, and other disfigurements have an obscuring effect. In addition, married love is too often profaned by excessive self-love, the worship of pleasure, and illicit practices against human generation. Moreover, serious disturbances are caused in families by modern economic conditions, by influences at once social and psychological, and by the demands of civil society. Finally, in certain parts of the world, problems resulting from population growth are generating concern. All these situations, and all the ones that we've just talked about since our break, have produced anxiety of consciences. Yet, the power and strength of the institution of marriage and family can also be seen in the fact that time and again, despite the difficulties produced, the profound changes in modern society reveal the true character of this institution in one way or another. So, the Second Vatican Council provides us a little bit of hope as well. That marriage has been in crisis since the fall. And it is in crisis today. But marriage is so excellent. It is so ordained by God. It is so closely connected with the Trinity. It is so closely connected with Christ and his covenant relationship with the church. It is so important in the eyes of God that just as much as it will be attacked by the deceptor, it will be protected by the author of marriage. That no matter what happens in society, the true institution of marriage has a way of shining forth. And so we are not to be dismayed, but we're also not to close our eyes to the challenges associated with our pastoral ministry.
Hey, there we I don't know how much more I could yell. I wasn't working on it. So the sacrament, the true institution of marriage, has a way of showing itself forth no matter what. I want to go back as a final point to the definition of marriage that we talked about, Catechism 1131, or the definition of sacraments. Sorry, this was the definition of sacraments. They're efficacious signs of grace instituted by Christ and trusted to the church, by which divine life is dispensed to us. The rituals, the rites by which we celebrate them are themselves signs which point to the graces that are actually received in the celebration of the sacraments. And this was the third part of that definition. I split it up into 3 parts. Sacraments bear fruit in those who receive them with the required dispositions. We have to be well disposed for the reception of a sacrament. Otherwise, when we talk about juridic sacraments, the sacrament happens, but we don't get the fruit, we don't get the grace, because there's something blocking the grace from entering our souls, the divine life from entering into our life. We have to be properly disposed if we want to receive the sacraments fruitfully. This goes for any of the sacraments. And so, a provocative question is, how well disposed are couples, try as we might, to receiving the grace of the sacrament? How can we help them to be properly disposed? I would submit, it's been said by some people that there are a lot of invalid marriages out there just waiting to be annulled, that a lot of people didn't know what they were getting into. It's a pretty pessimistic view. It might be true, it might not. I would submit this as my own provocative version of it for our reflection today. Might be true, it might not be. I think there might be a lot of couples out there that are truly married but aren't receiving the fruits of God's grace because they're not properly disposed to receive them. They're in marriages, but who wants to be in a marriage without the help of God's grace? Who wants to be cut off from that help? It's too hard of a life to live. We would say with the apostles, if that's the case, perhaps it's better for us not to get married. And the Lord says, it's not for everyone. It's for those who have been chosen, who have been called. And you have been called. He says, I will give you the help that you need. But if we're not properly disposed to receive it, then we're on our own. Not because Christ withholds his grace, but because we're not open to receiving it. So, without naming names, just think, how properly disposed are some of the couples who are coming to receive the sacrament today? How many of them receive the sacrament of reconciliation before they receive the sacrament of marriage? I mean, we'll never know, because we don't quiz people as they come out of the confessional, right? It's a confidential thing. But do we encourage that? We should certainly do that with First Communion. We certainly do that with confirmation. We take all the kids, come to confession so that they'll be properly received, disposed. The idea is that hopefully they know how to make a good confession. That their hearts will be open to the grace we're receiving. Do we encourage that among the couples as part of their wedding preparation? We have a whole list of things that they ought to do as part of their wedding preparation. Is reconciliation on the list? Is attending Sunday Mass and receiving the Holy Eucharist part of the list? If they're not going to Sunday Mass, then we've got to revisit that confession question anyway. But are they receiving the Eucharist regularly in preparation, intentionally, with the idea that I'm preparing for something big here and I need the help of God's grace now? And what is our marriage preparation like? That's why marriage preparation is so important. Marriage preparation has several stages. And we often hear, in regards to catechesis, 3 different stages of catechesis. You have remote preparation, proximate preparation, and immediate preparation. Have you heard those before? So remote catechesis starts long before anyone's thinking about getting married. Remote catechesis on marriage is good and holy married parents showing their children from a young age what it means to be in a good and holy Christian marriage. That's remote catechesis. That's Christian couples of all varieties being a witness for the children and for the young adults in their parish about what a good and holy Christian marriage looks like. What a good and holy Christian life looks like. That's all part of remote catechesis. It's always ongoing for the youngest of people, for the youngest of generations. More proximate catechesis is the kind of preparation that we should be giving to young adults on how to discern their vocation. I think there's a lot of discernment that goes into becoming a deacon, right? They don't just sign you right up. It's not 6 months and then you're in. It's a process of years to discern whether you're called to holy orders. I was in seminary discerning my call to the priesthood for 9 years. 9 years to decide whether God was in fact calling me to be a priest. How much proximate preparation of that variety do we do with couples? Helping them to discern, first of all, if they're called to marriage. We probably lose out on a lot of priestly and religious vocations because kids aren't asking the question. And you'll say, well, Father, the vast majority of them are called to marriage. And that's true. But they don't know that. They don't know they're called unless they've heard the voice of the one who's calling them. Unless they've asked the question, Lord, is this what you have planned for me? It's true, for the vast majority of young people, the answer will be, yes, I am calling you to marriage. But they have to have that conversation with the Lord. They have to know a little bit about discernment. About that this is God's will for your life, that He created you for this. That needs to be part of our proximate preparation. And then we have the immediate preparation, which is often very practical and very good and very logistical. And we do this well in a lot of ways, I think, generally speaking. When we talk to couples about the importance of communication and finance and in-laws and things like that, the practical realities of how to be married, not neglecting the spiritual realities of how to pray together, how to pray for one another. That's always one of the questions on the focus that I think is really good. And it doesn't come up often, but sometimes it comes up as flag if you use focus in your parishes. One of the questions on focus, or one of the statements is, I pray for my future spouse regularly. And I mean, I've only been in parish ministry, I will admit, for a little over a year. But already, I can think of a couple times when that question has been flagged in focus. Because this engaged couple sitting in front of me says, no, I'm not praying for my future spouse regularly. That breaks my heart a little bit. If you're not praying for them, who is? If they're not praying for you, who is? Isn't that the greatest sign of love? Isn't that like a basic thing that people who love each other do? Is pray for one another? We're supposed to pray for our enemies. We're not even praying for people we love. But to include that as part of our proximate preparation is also important. I would add a fourth, and I was talking a little bit about this during the break, and I will also, full disclosure, it's also what I wrote my thesis about for my postgraduate degree, so that always tends to be the pet project of someone who's done one of those theses. I'll add a fourth category there that is not just because it's part of my thesis, but it's part of the tradition of the church. And the fourth moment of catechesis is mystagogy. The catechesis that comes after you receive the sacrament. We talk about mystagogy a lot when it has to do with RCIA. I think sometimes we talk about it more than we do it. But we do talk about it a lot. It's part of the RCIA program that after they receive the sacraments, we're supposed to meet again 4 times of catechesis to say, okay, now you are baptized. We've talked to you about baptism before. Now you are baptized. Here's how you live as a baptized person. We've talked to you about the Holy Eucharist. Here's how you live the Eucharist. We've talked to you about marriage. Now here is a moment of catechesis on how to live as a married couple. We can talk all we want about being married, but they won't know what it's like until they're actually living it, right? We can talk till we're blue in the face. We can read all of the church documents. We can show them all of the videos in the world, send them to every workshop. And all that is good. It's not bad. We shouldn't stop doing those other forms of catechesis. But something will change on their wedding day. Just like something changed on the day of our baptism, our confirmation, our first Holy Communion, our ordination. And you begin to really understand the sacrament in a new way once you have received it. It makes all the sense in the world. Are we giving them the catechesis, the mystagogical catechesis, the mystagogy, that they need to dive deep and live that sacrament? That's also a pastoral challenge. Not only the preparation, but the ongoing catechesis. And we do have some wonderful programs for that. We have Worldwide Marriage Encounter, which is a form of mystagogical catechesis. Would that more couples experience that? We have Retrobide, which is more geared towards those who are having troubles in their marriage. That's a type of mystagogy. Let's not miss that. Let's not miss any of those 4 elements of catechesis. A chance to teach the truth and to proclaim the good news about marriage. We've been through a lot today. Covered a lot of ground. And hopefully, you've been able to put some puzzle pieces together with marriage in a new way before. Like I said, it's difficult for the professed celibate to stand in front of a group of people who are mostly married and propose to talk about marriage. Hopefully, you've seen God's plan in a new or more expanded way, in a deeper way. You've understood your own vocation to marriage and your vocation to be ministers of marriage. Marriage being one of the sacraments that's entrusted to the ministry of deacons in the church. So you have your own heightened responsibility, not just as married couples, but as deacons of the church, to proclaim with your lives, with your deeds, and with your words, the good news about marriage, the gospel of the family. It's so important. It touches on the most profound aspects of humanity. It touches on the most profound aspects of theology. It touches on the most profound aspects of life. Marriage is so important. It's also so attacked. And so our charge is clear. Our charge is weighty. But our charge is a joyful charge because it is good news. It's not always easy to hear. It's not always easy to preach. It's not always easy to live. But it is profoundly good. It is profoundly beautiful. And it's good and it's beautiful because it's true. So I hope you've gotten a little bit better understanding about the truth of marriage so that we can go to the world and live and proclaim its beauty and its goodness. We have, it's not lunchtime yet, sorry. We have about 20 minutes left. I would be very happy to entertain questions that you might have for me about the presentation, or about marriage, or about anything. You know, I'm newly ordained, so I have the answers to everything. That's what I tell my pastor. I know everything, don't worry about it. Oh dear, one of my deacons, yes.
I have a simple question.
Yes, take your time.
I missed the third of the catechesis. What exactly was that?
The immediate catechesis is the stuff that we do right, it's what we would call marriage preparation. It's the stuff we do right before they're getting married. It's often very practical, but it also has that spiritual element. That's how I would define it. I mean, other people might define the moments of catechesis a little bit differently. I would put immediate catechesis in marriage preparation, proximate catechesis being the kind of catechesis that we need to do generally about vocation, about marriage, for teenagers and young adults, and remote catechesis being the lifelong growing up in a society and in a church and in a parish and in a family that preaches holy matrimony by the way they live. Yes, please.
I have sort of a very technical theological question about marriage.
I'll push my glasses up.
Okay.
Ready to go.
Beginning with, I'll say, natural marriage between two non-baptized individuals. Not sacramental. When one, take a condition, one of them entering church through baptism. So you now have the nature of the consent in natural marriage. Now you have one of them baptized. The idea of a sacrament happening automatically, obviously at that point it hasn't happened because that marriage still technically can be dissolved. If the unbaptized person was unwilling to remain baptized.
Right.
But if both, my understanding is if both enter the church and both are baptized, then their initial consent, which was in a natural sense, and perhaps a different understanding of marriage, then it will automatically, through the sacrament of baptism, ratifies the sacrament of marriage. And I guess I don't see how two sacraments happen. And one happens instantaneously or simultaneously or whatever. And when there wasn't any ritual or anything else around it, what the necessary elements that we used to define marriage didn't exist, but that only of baptism.
Okay. All right. So I'll try to repeat that succinctly for anyone who might not be able to hear that. The question is about a natural marriage between, he used the example of two unbaptized people. So that would be a valid marriage, a natural marriage, but not a sacramental marriage. The same thing is true of one baptized person and a non-baptized person. Even if one of them is baptized, it's still not sacramental. Sacramental marriage is between two baptized Christians. His question is if at the time these two non-baptized people get married, they have a valid natural marriage, and then somehow, if they both get baptized, all of a sudden this is magically sacramental without anything else happening. And the question is sort of, how can that be with them having gotten married before when they didn't even know about Jesus and grace and all those things? They didn't believe in those things. How can all of a sudden that consent from 20 years ago, let's say, all of a sudden become sacramentalized? This is why it's very important to understand that marriage is unique among the sacraments and that there is nothing different from the natural consent and the sacramental consent. What's different is the grace, but the consent is the same. Marriage, by nature, means a man and a woman uniting their whole of life for the procreation and education of offspring and the good of the spouses. That's natural marriage. That's sacramental marriage. Except Christ gives grace to that marriage to help them live it out. Because it is hard, because our nature is fallen. It is hard to live that out without the grace of Christ. So a natural marriage is the same thing as a sacramental marriage, just without the grace. In theory, when the unbaptized couple gets married at the Justice of the Peace or wherever they do it, they intend to enter into a lifelong union and bring about children from them. If they don't intend to do that, then they're not married. That's why changing definitions of marriage in our culture today make things really hairy. Because there are plenty of people who get married civilly who don't intend those things. We would contend that they're not actually married then. If they didn't intend that when they exchanged consent, then they're not married. And so sacramental grace doesn't all of a sudden appear for an invalid marriage. Sacramental grace comes about at baptism for a valid natural marriage. So that presumes that the people, when they exchanged consent, intended this to be a lifelong union of a man and a wife for the offspring of children, the good of spouses. And then, because baptism plugs you into the life of grace, and so Christ pours his grace out onto that marriage as well. I would think so. I would think so. Interestingly, I've been told this, so I am neither a canon lawyer nor a civil lawyer. But I'll throw him right under the bus. Monsignor Vasco is the one who told me this. That the requirement, there is such a thing as a civil annulment. You guys probably know that. There's a lot of people who don't know that. There's such a thing as a civil annulment. And the qualifications, the conditions for a civil annulment, according to what I've been told, are the same as the requirements for a church annulment. They look at the same things, at the consent and the intention. Now, no one gets civil annulments anymore because there's no fault divorce. And divorce is much cheaper and less of a process than an annulment. But even the civil authority, in theory, the less and less, as time goes on, recognized what marriage is. It's indissoluble, it's lifelong. And anyone who doesn't enter into that, baptized or not, anyone who doesn't enter into that with that condition is not entering into a valid marriage. And the civil authorities would declare that null. They used to. Again, definitions of marriage in the state are changing, so I don't know what the civil authority would do now. But the church would also declare that to be null. So it does involve a little investigation, I think, on the part of the people who are bringing them into the church. And you have to look at that original consent and see if that consent was authentic.
How does that apply to the Pauline principle of being able to separate when we have one baptized?
How does that apply to the Pauline privilege and the Petrine privilege, which are two exceptions to the rule of marriage? Which will be excellent questions for you to ask Father Hoyles. No, they're good questions. And the Pauline and Petrine privileges are exceptions to the rule. And we say, but if you can make this exception, why can't you make other exceptions? Because I'm not St. Peter and I'm not St. Paul. So these are exceptions which are found in the scriptures. St. Paul says specifically, if two people were married and then one becomes a believer and the other one wants to leave, let the other person go. And that person is no longer bound by it. So St. Paul said that, not just in casual conversation, but in the scriptures. St. Paul was inspired by the Holy Spirit to give that exception. And it is an exception. But Father Hoyles will be much more able to adequately explain that as a canon lawyer than I would be. So save that one. Does that answer your question a little bit? Okay. Yes, in the back.
And more of a comment than a question. I use in my marriage prep, I've used that Ephesians 5, regularly as part of it. Usually spend about an hour just on that scripture. But I think now I know that for what looking at the theology of marriage, that last verse of it doesn't necessarily fit in as far as the theology, but for the practical part of it. The last verse,
Right.
And I think that, it just adds in, a more practical as well as theological aspect of it. So I see that reading from Paul touching on not just the theological, but also the very, very practical basis, for that. And it's interesting. I worked a fair amount with ones that have been, are, in a second marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one when you come back to some of these things, when they look back to their first marriage, they say that's missing.
Right. So it does have a very practical application as well. This might be, I don't know, this may even be sinful. Have any of you ever recommended a book to people that you've never read it yourself? There's a book that I recommend to people a lot, and I will confess to this group of holy deacons and their wives, but I've never read it myself. It's called The 5 Love Languages. So I should read it, so I'll do that in my spare time. But I've heard such wonderful things about it that it touches on that very thing, the very practical ways of expressing love and respect to your spouse. And the fact that the way you express it might not be the way that the other person receives it. You might be speaking different love languages. So it's on my stack of books to read. But that's what made me think of that right away, that there is a very practical application there. Because everyone needs to be loved, and everyone needs to be respected. But we communicate and receive that in different ways. Individually as people, but also as men and women. Yes?
After this presentation, I'm trying to wrap my mind around this concept of natural marriage. Insofar as cohabitation, two individuals truly believe that they're in love with one another, they will use the old, it's not about paper. And I'm almost getting the sense that what we're doing in saying natural marriage is saying that it doesn't require paper. It requires these two to truly love one another, and to say they believe they love one another, and that they mean it forever, and that they do both want children in that. Does that qualify as natural marriage?
Okay, now don't tell Father Boyles this. None of it requires paper. Don't tell anyone that it's none of this requires paper. You should do it. Fill out everything, sign it all, send it. Do what you need to do. But the sacrament of marriage doesn't require paper. It's not about the piece of paper. What it does require, though, is a public commitment. And so, even on the natural level, what a natural marriage is a couple makes a public commitment. Now, there are varying degrees of public. It doesn't necessarily mean, and the sacramental marriage does not necessarily mean, you have a big wedding ceremony. You'll have couples that say, well, I don't need the dress and the party and the big event or a piece of paper. It's true. You don't need any of those things for a sacramental marriage or a natural marriage. But what you do need is a public commitment. Even if that's a public commitment with me and 3 other people. So the church picks 3 people. In a pinch, I suppose you can do it even with 1. It has to be some sort of public commitment. That this isn't just a private agreement between you and me that we're together for life. But it's a public, because it changes the way we interact with the whole world. It changes our position in the community. That we have publicly declared that I belong to her and she belongs to me. That we have become one. That changes the way we interact with society. It changes our place in society. And so it's, by its nature, calls for a public commitment. So even a natural marriage, by its nature, in a way, demands that public commitment. It doesn't demand paperwork. It doesn't demand a license. It doesn't demand a marriage preparation sheet. All of those things are very convenient ways for us to order society. Society needs order. So that's why we have them and they're good, but they're not essential to it. What's essential to it is the public commitment. There was a time, especially in the Middle Ages, when all of this was up in the air, and you had this phenomenon of clandestine marriages, When two people would run off by themselves, they would commit themselves to one another. But then there was no public proof of that. And so they said, but we made the declaration to one another. And so upon reflection, they said, no, it has to be, for it to be a marriage, there has to be some sort of public, definitive, concrete commitment. Whether the public is one person who witnesses it, or a church full of 500 people, or all of the world, if it's the royal wedding, it demands some sort of public thing. Does that make any sense? So it's not just an agreement between two people. It changes their status in wider society. It says to the world that this is a stable family unit, that we are a family now. It separates us from all others. Part of the marriage rite, I think in the marriage translations are still different in every country, and probably always will be. I think it's in Britain that part of the vows includes the words, forsaking all others, which is a public thing to do. I choose you, forsaking all others. So even on a natural level, that's what marriage is. It's the choosing of one person to the exclusion of other people. And so that's a public act by its very nature. So it requires the public act, if not the whole shebang. Does that answer your question? Maybe a little bit?
Well, I'm thinking, let's say, for example, my son and his girlfriend have done that, and they've spoken it clearly in front of my wife and I. All of a sudden, that is now a valid marriage.
No. So, is your son baptized?
Yes.
Okay. Is he Catholic?
Yes.
Okay. Then he has the obligation, because we are bound to Christ and his church, to follow what the church says is public. So the church, for public, means in front of a minister of God's church. So you are a minister of God's church. So if it was you and your wife and had one other person, and they exchanged vows using valid words, the church says public means this. Public means there's a representative of the church who ordinarily is a bishop, priest, or deacon, and that there are two other witnesses there. That's what the church has decided public means. And the church has said that by consent we mean these words, either said or responded to via questions. The church gets to define what public means. And people who are part of the church are obligated to follow that, because we are subordinate to Christ and his church. And so if we don't follow that, then all of a sudden we're not doing that validly. People who aren't part of the church are not bound to do that. And so, if you were all unbaptized, let's say, if your son and his girlfriend and you and your wife were all unbaptized people, and they stood up and made, in front of you and your wife, and made a public declaration, you can make an argument that that is a valid natural marriage. It wouldn't be recognized by the state or the church or anything else because there's no proof. But it would still be valid natural marriage. That's in essence what a lot of people do when they get married on a beach or at Disney World. They're just standing up in front of whoever is there, and they're making that public declaration. If you were all unbaptized, that would be fine. If you're a baptized member of Christ's church, you have to follow Christ's rules for what that means. And the church can tweak that a little bit. So the church is the administrator of the sacrament, so she can say, well, it needs to be a representative of the church, so we have one of our guys there doing it. But already there's an exception that if there's no bishop, priest, or deacon around, it can be a layperson who's delegated for that purpose. Now, in the United States, we don't really have that problem because there's always, you can drive in your car to the next pair of children. There's a bishop, a priest, or a deacon there. But in mission territories, when you only see a priest once every 4 months, there's already a provision that says, okay, then you don't need a priest. It can be someone else on behalf of the church to do that. So there can be some tweaking there but the essential character of it being public is maintained. Okay? I saw a couple other hands. If there are quick questions, I'll try and answer them. We're running low on time. You're back there first.
I like what you said about how churches are attacked by Satan and the sacrament of marriage. Do you, in your humble opinion, see the sacrament of marriage becoming stronger or weaker by the redefinition of marriage?
By the redefinition of marriage, that seeks to weaken marriage. That seems to be. Because if marriage can mean anything, sacramental. See, here's the thing, is that I think you go back to Pius XI, and if you read all of Casti Connubii, he speaks about this desire to separate the idea of sacramental marriage from the state. Who else talks about this? I think G.K. Chesterton wrote about it in his time as well. This desire to separate the two. The problem with separating the two is that they're the same event in theory. And so if you change the civil definition of marriage, it doesn't affect our sacrament. That doesn't change because we decide what the sacraments are. But the sacrament is supposed to be the same as the natural event. It was intended to be that way. And so, while the changing of a civil definition of marriage doesn't change the sacramental definition, it clouds our understanding of it. Because marriage is not something that's just for Christians. It's something that's on the natural level that has been raised to the level of a sacrament. But it's not a niche thing. And we risk it being seen a niche thing. And so that weakens the overall perception of it. Not eating meat on Fridays, that's a Catholic thing. That's a niche thing. And so it's okay if it's seen as a niche thing. But marriage was not intended to be that way. It's not a niche thing, it's a natural thing. And so the changing of the natural definition weakens or clouds our understanding. It doesn't change it. Sacramental marriage will always be sacramental marriage. But it clouds our understanding of it. And so in that sense, it weakens. Does that make sense? Okay.
Father Jeff, there was a beautiful body of teaching that's been developed and espoused by St. John Paul II, the theology of the body. And today, earlier in your discussion, you talked about many of those things. But it seems to me that as an institution, the church has not embraced that teaching. And in many cases, many of the priests, deacons, clerics have not embraced that teaching and made it a part of their instruction, a part of their catechesis in their parishes in terms of incorporating it into RCIA programs, adult education programs, just many of the things that go on in the parish, religious ed, religious students. In our schools, in only a handful of schools probably, have we incorporated this beautiful teaching into the curriculum. Why are we not speaking about this? In many ways, it's the antidote to the things that we see going on in our culture today. It just seems to me that there's a fear out there of this teaching and a reluctance on the part of the church to embrace it and really promote it in our parishes.
Okay, so the question was about theology of the body, and it was an observation that there seems to be a reluctance to really incorporate that into our pastoral ministry. And this is, again, St. Paul says, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel, whole and entire." And the temptation of any ministry is that there are parts of the gospel that make us uncomfortable, or that maybe even we disagree with or don't yet understand. And so the temptation is to soft pedal that. And so for some people, that is the theology of the body. There are people in the church who disagree with the theology of the body. Theology of the body being a set of teachings proposed by St. John Paul II. There are people who disagree with it, so they don't want to talk about it. There are people who it makes uncomfortable to speak about that, so they don't want to talk about it. You can say that for anything as well, though. There are people who disagree with Humanae Vitae, and so they don't talk about it. Or there are people who are uncomfortable speaking about Humanae Vitae because they know it's a very challenging teaching, and so they soft pedal. There are people who are uncomfortable. There are people who disagree with the idea of sin. I've met them. I had a professor in college who said, sin went out with Vatican II. He said, you need to reread some things. There are people who disagree with that, so they don't talk about it. There are people who, for them, talking about sin makes them uncomfortable, and so they soft pedal. Pick your poison, but it's all poison. Woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. And so, since we're talking about marriage and family today, it is important for us to know the beauty of, to know the truth and to preach the truth. And so, the church has wonderful teachings. The Theology of the Body by St. John Paul II. Familiaris Consortio was an encyclical letter by St. John Paul II on marriage and family. Humanae Vitae by Paul VI. Casti Connubii by Pius XI. These are things that we have a responsibility as ministers to sort of take this all in, not so we can just spit it back out at people, but so that we have the wider perspective and we can draw people into the joy of the gospel. Because it's good news. All of it's good news, even if it's hard to take. So, Deacon Jim is approaching me. I can see, I can sense it. My time is up. We're 5 minutes over. Lunch is ready.
Thank you.
Sorry. The prayer I'm going to use as the closing is the prayer that Pope Francis has written and given to us. He gave it before the last synod, the extraordinary synod on marriage and family, and he asked people to pray this leading up to the synod. We're approaching another synod on the marriage and the family, so we'll pray this prayer together. We'll make this our prayer, and then we'll bless our food. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, in you we contemplate the splendor of true love. To you we turn with trust. Holy Family of Nazareth, grant that our families too may be places of communion and prayer, authentic schools of the gospel, and small domestic churches. Holy Family of Nazareth, may families never again experience violence, rejection, and division. May all who have been hurt or scandalized find ready comfort and healing. Holy Family of Nazareth, may the approaching Synod of Bishops make us once more mindful of the sacredness and inviolability of the family and its beauty in God's plan. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, graciously hear our prayer. Amen. Bless us,